Identifying the cause, or causes, of political events is one of the central tasks of political science. Talking about cause and effect seems easy. One thing leads to another. But defining what a cause is gets harder the more you think about it, especially in politics. In this video lecture, I will outline the technical definition of causality, focusing on three key elements: separating cause and effect, eliminating alternate explanations, and thinking about likely rather than absolute causes. One reason we focus on causal questions in this class is that they're often really hard to answer. Take the question of whether economic development causes democracy. Even after we define our terms, there are many ways that development might lead to democracy. Development might lead to a larger middle class, who starts to demand political rights to match their economic power. Or development might empower the working class, who protest to improve their conditions. Or we might see a relationship between development and democracy, but democracy might be the cause, not the effect, of economic development if it creates political institutions that promote innovation and growth. So when thinking about causality, we have to identify different possible causes and whether we're really talking about a cause or an effect. So I don't have a definitive answer to this question, but we can start tackling it by being clearer about what we mean by a cause. This is debated in the philosophy of science, but in social science we tend to use a formal definition of causality developed by the psychologists William Shadish, Thomas Cook, and Donald Campbell. There are three things you need to call something a cause. First, correlation. Your cause needs to be related to your effect. Or using more formal language, the independent variable and dependent variable should change together. Now, correlation alone does not mean that one thing causes another, but without some kind of relationship, there's definitely no cause. The second item is temporal precedence. Your cause needs to happen before the effect. As with correlation, this is fairly obvious, but it's not always easy to show when we're talking about things like democracy and development, which tend to happen slowly. Third, and finally, we need to eliminate alternate explanations. This is the most important of these three criteria and the hardest one to do. Let me give you a few examples to demonstrate this. The most famous example of how correlation is not causation is the fact that ice cream sales are correlated with shark attacks. Just because people are eating more ice cream doesn't cause them to be eaten by sharks, even though you could create a story in which that makes sense. There's an alternate explanation, though, that makes more sense. A third factor, hot weather, can explain both why people are eating more ice cream and why they are more likely to be attacked by a shark, since they're more likely to be at the beach. Here we have two variables that are related, but we don't see one clearly happening before the other, and we can't rule out an alternate explanation. This is what is called spurious correlation. If you remember one thing about causality, it's that correlation is necessary for causation, but it's not the same thing. Spurious correlation is when two things are related, but only because they are both caused by a third factor. This is a confounding variable, or a control variable, and this is why we must eliminate alternate explanations if we want to show one thing causes another. To come back to democracy and development then, if we wanted to show that a rising middle class leads to democratization, we'd need to show that the cause isn't a more educated population or labor protests. This is hard because it can be difficult to separate variables like education from economic power. They're all correlated with democracy. It's also hard to come up with a complete list of possible explanations for why one country might become democratic. In political science, we don't usually prove causality, but we can rule out alternatives. And every time we examine a question, we can get closer to a truth. I do want to touch on the final two parts of this formal definition. These aren't requirements, but they are nice to have. Manipulation means running an experiment. The easiest way to think of this is a clinical trial for a vaccine. We can conclude a treatment is or is not effective by randomizing who receives it during the test period. We will talk later about how we do this in political science and public policy, but it's not possible to do this for all political questions. So this is why it's nice to have, but not necessary. Last, it is also helpful to be able to describe a causal mechanism, the process by which a cause leads to an effect. This is something we often can do in political science. We can describe the history of a country, for example, but it isn't a formal requirement because it's actually often missing in medicine. For example, we knew that aspirin reduces headaches long before we understood the biology of how it actually works. So those are nice to have, But the key parts of demonstrating causality are showing that the cause and effect change together, showing that the cause comes before the effect, and showing that nothing else can explain the relationship. I want to end this with a brief discussion of some of the adjectives you might see associated with the word cause in our reading. We also talk a lot about proximate and distal causes. A proximate cause is a short-term cause. For example, protests leading to the resignation of a leader. A distal cause is a long-term one. For example, changes in the structure of an economy might create the conditions for democratization. Both proximate and distal causes can be true, but you should be clear about which one you're interested in. Finally, in politics, we almost never study what are called deterministic relationships. Deterministic means that when one thing, a cause, happens, an effect always happens. The problem is that there are always exceptions in politics. We almost never see the kind of definitive relationships we study in physics or chemistry. Instead, we study what conditions make an effect more likely or increase the probability. We study probabilistic relationships. I wanted to familiarize you with these terms, but remember the key things from this lecture are: be clear about what you think is a cause versus an effect. Separate them out. The key factor in determining causality is eliminating alternate explanations. And finally, in politics we need to think probabilistically. We think about what conditions make outcomes more likely.